Welcome to another episode of the Doctors Building Wealth podcast. So Kenji and I often get this question, which is, if I buy a short-term rental towards the end of the year, how can I get my 100 hours in? And this is usually a question we get from people who are very motivated to take advantage of the tax benefits of short-term rentals. And they know that they can do this tax loophole where they do 100 hours on their short-term rental and more than anyone else in a calendar year. And keep in mind, a short-term rental has an average length of stay of 7 days or less. So people are saying to themselves, hey, I want to do 100 hours more than anyone else in this calendar year, but I'm buying this property in November. And how am I going to be able to get my 100 hours in? So we wanted to take a few moments to discuss this and talk about how to get your hours in if you're buying a short-term rental towards the end of the year.
Yeah, in terms of hours, I wanted to specify that these are called material participation hours, which is a mouthful. And so you might be wondering, what are material participation hours? And we're going to include a download in the show notes where you can read more about material participation and what counts as material participation hours. But in this episode, we're going to cover some of the highlights. So when it comes to material participation hours, the IRS actually doesn't specify exactly what counts in terms of material participation. What they do is they provide broad categories, things like acquisition activities, management activities, leasing activities. These are very, very broad categories. The problem is that those broad categories don't provide the specifics of what actually counts. And so for this, what we've done in the download is we provided some ideas of what some of these things could be. Again, the IRS doesn't specify exactly what it is, but what we did was we took those broad categories and then we identified some activities that make sense, for each of those categories. For example, if we're talking about management of your short-term rental, then if let's say that you communicate with your cleaner to organize a cleaning, all those feel pretty logical. All those feel like they should count under management of your short-term rental, and that's what we included in the list.
So we're talking about, those 100 hours of material participation hours that you need to spend on your short-term rental. I just want to clarify why it's so important that you want to do that, right? It's because that allows you to be able to tap into this tax loophole where you're going to be able to take your losses from that short-term rental. And by losses, I mean paper losses. They're not necessarily real losses. You could be cash flowing on your short-term rental and still show a loss on your taxes because you're using depreciation. So what's happening is the government sees that your property is losing value every single year. The building is losing value every year in their eyes. Even if the building is gaining in value, in the government's eyes, your building is losing value every single year, and that's called depreciation. And what a lot of us do with our short-term rentals is when we do this 100 hours and more than anyone else, when we use this short-term rental tax loophole, what we're doing is we're taking a lot of the depreciation losses that would usually be spread over 39 years, and we're actually shifting them to the first year that we own that property. And so what we really want to do is we want to be active investors. We want to be able to use those losses from our short-term rental to shelter active income like W-2 income or 1099 income or business income. And that allows us to get a tax benefit of owning that short-term rental the very first year. But in order to access that tax benefit, we have to do the 100 hours of more than anyone else. So we have to understand that material participation. What counts as material participation? What kind of activities can I do to get those 100 hours? Now, how do you get enough hours? Because 100 hours can seem like a lot to people. Well, when you're going for those 100 hours, especially if you are a remote investor, because I think this is one area where people get really tripped up. They're like, it's November, I have to do 100 hours and more than anyone else. Yeah, I now understand what counts as material participation, but how am I going to get all that in a month? And how am I going to get my property ready to be listed online, to be able to be rented? Because that's really an important key here is you got to get it available for rent by the end of the year if you want to get bonus depreciation that year. So how are you going to go do that if you're an investor from afar?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, first off, 100 hours may seem like a lot, but I seem to recall that as residents, we used to do 100 hours in a week.
Well, I don't know if I did 100 hours in a week. Maybe old school resident Kenji did.
Yeah, I definitely did over 100 hours a week back when I was a resident. So what does that mean? So that could mean, and one thing you could do, and this is something that some of our students have done, is plan a week and go to the property, right? And then just plan, essentially set up the property during that week. That means, getting all the furniture delivered to the property. Then what you do is you spend that entire week, building furniture, setting up that property for your first guest. And again, you need to make sure that you get that guest before the end of the year. In fact, a lot of CPAs talk about getting several guest stays before the end of the year. And so let's say that, you end up putting in 12 hours a day for 7 days, then that's 84 hours right there just from setting up your property.
Yeah, and you may not actually need that many hours. I think, there's a lot of hours that go into, getting a property under contract, doing due diligence, going through and doing all the paperwork that goes into buying a property. And then once you close on that property, you're going online and you're shopping for things. You're thinking about all the different pieces you need to just outfit a kitchen, for example. There's a lot of activities that even happen before you get to the property. And so what oftentimes people find is they don't need to do 84 more hours. It's pretty easy to get the hours in. And if you're struggling with the hours, what we would suggest is asking yourself, how can I make this a better guest experience for my guests that are going to come and stay in this short-term rental? And that'll allow you to come up with ideas to improve things for your guests. And also those ideas are going to take some time to implement. An example of that might be like building a guest book, right? Where they find out about the local hikes and the local restaurants and giving them all the emergency numbers, all those types of things, which have gotten a lot easier with ChatGPT, I have to say. It used to take us a lot of time to be able to make guest books. It doesn't take as much time anymore. But those are the types of ideas that you can come up with when you say, hey, how can I make this a better experience for my guests in my short-term rental? And it'll give you ideas of activities you can do that will take some time. And so actually going on the property and having work days may become even unnecessary or at least a lot less important than you might imagine.
Yeah, to give you another example, there's something called the Thanksgiving test, which is that you want to set up your kitchen so that the guests that are staying there can actually have a Thanksgiving dinner. And that may require a lot of different utensils and tools and things that you'll need in the kitchen that may be a huge list. And just compiling that list, again, as Leti said, you don't have to actually be on site to compile the list and order all these different things, but you can imagine the number of hours it will take just to get your kitchen ready for a Thanksgiving dinner. The other thing I wanted to mention is that material participation allows a couple who are filing jointly to both contribute to the hour. So in other words, one spouse could do 50 hours and the other spouse could do 60 hours for a total of 110 hours. So that would allow you to exceed the hours with two people, right? And so again, I know not everybody has that situation, but if you are a couple and you're filing jointly, then both of you can contribute to the material participation hours.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great option, especially if you have different interests or different passions. Maybe one of you is really into design and the other person is really handy at putting together IKEA furniture. Like that allows you to be able to each, tap into what you enjoy in the process and do those 100 hours and more than anyone else. Now, one of the keys here is more than anyone else. What does that even mean? And by the way, we are only covering one of the ways that you can get material participation and be able to really, take a short-term rental and use it to shelter W-2 income. But just for the ease of this episode, we wanted to make sure we talked about the 100 hours and more than anyone else and didn't go into the other ways that you can use a short-term rental to shelter active income. So just saying that more than anyone else, what does that mean? Well, that means that, you're doing more hours than a contractor or a cleaner or a property manager. And so for those of you who are buying at the end of the year in like November, what you're probably going to want to do is you're going to want to self-manage it. And maybe if you're going to do a rehab, you're going to do a very small rehab, not only because of time, but also because you don't want the contractor doing more hours than you. So you're not going to want to do a giant overhaul rehab. You're going to want to say, hey, let me set up this property. Let me get some stays ideally in it by the end of the year. And then maybe I'd actually do the rehab in January. And that's a better option to make sure that I get the 100 hours more than anyone else and, get it available to rent by the end of the year because I'm getting it right at the end of the year. And keep in mind, it's really a nice thing in some ways to buy it towards the end of the year because you can imagine if you buy it in January or February, then you're like, oh, I want to make sure I get more hours than anyone else. You might actually be self-managing for, 9, 10, 11, 12 months versus somebody who maybe knows they don't want to be an active manager of their property. They just have to do it for a month or two, buying at the end of the year. And then in January, they can hand it over to a property manager to run.
Yeah, self-management is one thing, but the other risk there is that is really the cleaner. So if you have a number of stays throughout the whole year, just think about all the hours that a cleaner is going to be spending at your property. That may mean that you may need to actually roll up the sleeves and do some of the cleaning during the year in order to make sure that you are doing more hours than the cleaner.
Yeah, and one of the keys here is really understanding how your CPA is reading the law, because some CPAs will say, "Hey, all the cleaners count as one person, and you got to do one more hours than all the cleaners combined." And some CPAs will say, "Well, each cleaner is an individual, and as long as you rotate cleaners, then you just have to get more hours than the cleaner who does the most hours." And so this is a plug for getting a really great CPA who understands what they're doing with short-term rentals, and also really understanding their read of the law, so you understand how they're interpreting it. So what we'll put in the resources section for you is we have a referral partner directory that we use for our students in semi-retired MD, and these are our trusted referral partners who take care of our community. A lot of them we use ourselves, and so that will give you an idea of maybe if you're looking for a real estate savvy CPA who really understands short-term rentals. That's where I would start looking, is to go to our referral directory and see who we think is a really great CPA for our real estate investor community. Okay, so we addressed, when I'm buying a short-term rental at the end of the year, how do I get those 100 hours of material participation? And remember, there's a download we're going to put into the show notes for you guys, as well as our link to our referral directory if you need a good CPA who really understands short-term rentals. Thanks for joining us this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to leave us a review and subscribe and share it with a friend who maybe is interested in going out and saving on taxes using short-term rentals this year and is wondering about how they're going to meet criteria for the 100 hours and more than anyone else. We'll see you next time.